And welcome to another treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled Nathan Condemns David. And it's taken from 2 Samuel, the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 9, and then jumping up to 13 through 15. And it's for February the 6th, 2022, and it's the winter quarter lesson number 10. Now, a little background information. Today's lesson is about the time that Nathan came and rebuked David. You remember David had that horrible sin that he committed with Bathsheba. And he had Uriah the Hittite killed. David hadn't went out and went to battle with his soldiers. He had sent other people to do his fighting. And he was on top of the palace on the rooftop and looked out there and saw Bathsheba bathing and lounging around and began to lust after her. And he went to check and inquire about her, found out that she was the only wife of Uriah the Hittite. And he commanded her to come to the palace, and he had committed adultery with Bathsheba. And then a couple of months later, Bathsheba told him that she was pregnant, and David had concocted a plan to cover up his sin. So he called for Uriah the Hittite to come in, thinking that he would go and spend time with his wife. And so that would cover up the fact that she was pregnant while he was at war. But Uriah the Hittite, out of his righteousness, would not go and back to his home with the men of the army out there at war, and they couldn't be at home. So he did not want to get any kind of special treatment. So David said, well, to himself, what I'll do is I'll just get Uriah the Hittite killed, and then when he dies, I'll marry Bathsheba. So he sent a letter, a command letter, to the general of the army and had Uriah the Hittite carry it that said, get in the heat of the battle, put Uriah in the place where he's going to get killed, and everybody back up from him and let him go ahead and get killed. So he sent Uriah the Hittite the command to get himself killed, and he knew because of Uriah the Hittite's loyalty that he wouldn't open up the letter to read it. So it was Uriah's own loyalty that aided in the murder of himself. Okay? Now, 2 Samuel 12:1, the Lord sent Nathan to David when he came to him, and he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich man and the other poor. Now, it's important for us to get a good grasp of that, of how that there was the story, this parable that Nathan is telling, that one of these people were rich and had all these resources, and this other one only had one sheep. Okay? Now, 2 Samuel 12:2 and 3, the rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it and grew up with him and his children. It shared his food and drank from his cup and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now, that describes the difference between David and Uriah the Hittite. Here Uriah the Hittite only had this one wife, and he loved her dearly. And David had all these wives, all these concubines, and such as that. And yet he reached out and grabbed Uriah the Hittite's wife. Okay? Now, continuing on, Nathan was continuing on with this parable. In 2 Samuel 12:4, now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. Now, it's important for us to remember how the culture and the society and the cities were back in this day. There were not really any hotels, and so it was an obligation of people of the town when somebody would come, as a visitor would come, for them to take them in and be hospitable. And it's in the Near East, it is famous how hospitable they are to house guests. Okay? And so that's what the rich man was doing the normal type of activity when a guest come, of being hospitable, preparing a place for them to stay and preparing a meal for them. Now, what is not normal is for someone who is rich, who has all of these sheep, for them to turn around and only not take any of their own sheep, but to take the sheep of some poor guy who only has one pet sheep. And it's important for us to also understand that in the Near East, there are a lot of times these people would use a sheep as a pet. So this was not like somebody reached out and grabbed his farm animal. It'd be like somebody grabbing one of your dogs and slaughtering your dog and feeding your dog that you love and care for to their house guest. Okay? Now, 2 Samuel 12:5-6. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." Well, David's first reaction is very ironic. And the reason why it's ironic is that death was not the penalty for stealing a sheep, but death was the penalty for committing adultery and also for murder, which David was guilty of both of those. Exodus 22:1, whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. That's what the penalty actually was. But listen to what it was with what David had actually done. Exodus 21:14, but if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. That's exactly what David had done. Then Leviticus 20:10, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the neighbors will be put to death. Okay? Now, what David had done here is a thing that psychologists call this projection. David had projected projected his own guilt into this story. And this is oftentimes a defense mechanism that people will do. You'll see people who'll get overboard about some kind of sin, and then sometimes you even see where they are guilty of that same sin. Without naming the guy's name, some time ago we had a guy who would constantly go up and down the street and talk and with signs talking about how homosexuality is such a horrible thing and that homosexuals need to be put in jail and what have you. And then several years later, it came out that he actually was a homosexual. And sometimes that happens where people will be guilty of something and they will just go overboard, constantly harping about a particular sin. And that apparently is the situation that happened with King David here, where he went way overboard over this sheep. Okay? Now, 2 Samuel 7 and 8. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. "I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more." So Nathan brings it home here. He takes the parable and shows David what this is really about. And the shock that must have hit David that moment when Nathan, by the power of God, let him know what this was really about. Okay? Now, 2 Samuel 12 and 9. "Why do you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." And what David did was absolutely so despicable. I mean, he took someone who was so loyal to him, who had only that one wife, and he took that wife, and then to cover his sin, he killed the man with his own loyalty. If Uriah the Hittite had been disloyal to David and been curious and opened up that letter, he would have seen the instructions that meant his death. If Uriah the Hittite had been a coward and had not wanted to die and not been loyal to David and to the things of God, Uriah the Hittite wouldn't have been killed. But he was loyal. He was faithful. It was his loyalty and his faithfulness that David used to kill him. That is how despicable what David did to Uriah the Hittite. Okay, 2 Samuel 12, 13 and 15. Then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah the Hittite had borne to David, and he became ill. There were horrible consequences of David's sin. Yes, the Lord forgave him. And yes, David was restored. But there were consequences for his actions. Okay? Now, in conclusion, there are a couple of things that I want to really point out. And really the main thing that I want to point out about this story of David. We already can see how despicable it was, how bad David messed up, and how horrible what he did was. But there's a huge difference between the way David handled this and the way that King Saul handled his failings. If you look at the story of Saul, King Saul, when he messed up, he wanted to cover it up. You remember when he didn't kill all the cattle, when he and Samuel came and told him that he had been disobedient, and Saul was trying to make excuses of why he did it. And Samuel pretty much said, well, if you were obedient, what's all this bleating of sheep in my ear and the mooing of cows in my ear? It's pretty obvious you were not obedient. And at the end of it, after Samuel told him that the kingdom was going to be ripped away from him and everything, Saul was worried about what the people would be thinking if Samuel didn't come and sacrifice with him. It was what people were thinking that Saul was worried about, not repenting to God. Okay? And we need to look at the two outcomes. Saul ended up in destruction and had the kingdom taken away from him. David was restored back to fellowship with God. So we need to know and be totally understanding of the fact that it does not matter what people think. And we need to not worry about what people think. We need to be concerned about making things right with God. Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.